Hello, this is lesson 10 in fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis. My name is Arch Woodside. I'm a retired professor at Boston College, and it's good to see you today. And I want to get started in just a minute. I want to mention this is the final lesson of the 10 lessons in the program. And we will have a new course on case study research methods sometime later this year, where we'll cover 12 different principal methods of research. fSQCA is a case research method, and where you have a sufficient number of cases to actually model your findings, and but you always stay at the case level. Let's get started today on the topics of the final lesson. And let me show you slides related to this. The topic is on predictive validation, in other words, replication. And let me mention to you that if you can build in replication in your study by having separate samples that you model each sample, or 3 or 4 samples, the quality of your paper is bumped up a lot, and reviewers really love you to test for predictive validation. Most studies only test for fit validity, not predictive validity. Now, predictive validity refers to testing of the same model for different samples. And also, we're going to talk a little bit about robustness testing of your calibrations. And we'll get into that in a minute. Let me mention the definition of predictive validation here. Separate testing a specific model for its accuracy separately on each of 2 or more samples of the same and different populations. All right, so you might have one population and you break it down into different segments by chronic conditions, such as B2B firms versus B2C firms, or by big firms versus small firms, or new firms versus older firms, and then test the same model on the different samples of your data. This is sometimes called, well, at least Hubbard would like to say that we ought to call this statistical sameness testing. And he recommends using this approach versus not using statistical significance testing. And I do recommend his book, Corrupt Research. It's a very good book. The only problem with it, there's no numerical examples in the book. And it would have been a home run in terms of the contribution if you would have had some numerical examples. I'm going to give you a source today, a free copy of this idea of having numerical examples of a VDR analysis, variable directional relationship analysis, versus case outcome analysis. And the same data, both models of approaches to data analysis are in the paper, and it's only about 20 pages long. I highly recommend it. I'll show it to you today. All right, so we're going to look at the Milton Friedman proposition, where he says that ESG should not be a factor in the goal of financial profitability, financial performance of the firm. And he's quite famous for making that statement. And so we're going to model corporate social performance. That's ESG, which stands for environment, social, and governance. And it's used interchangeably with corporate social performance of the firm. So version 1 of the model for B2B firms would be this, where the firm does comparatively poorly on the social condition, such as they don't pay their employees well, they don't give them benefits, they don't give them health care, and they keep down, they view employees as a cost that really needs to be controlled. And Walt Disney, for example, has been famous for this. And Amazon has had pretty low salaries and benefits. And maybe that's changing, but that's the idea of the negation. That's that sideways tilt before the S. And then low governance in terms of pollution and contributing to correcting climate change and other activities that the firm could be helpful on. So you don't engage in that. And then you have high performance in the past in terms of ROA. And we're only looking at B2B firms. So that's in 2011. And we're looking at Swedish companies, 66 Swedish companies. And we're saying that that's predictive of cases that are high in ROA, B2B cases or companies. I'm using case and firm interchangeably in 2015. And now, does this model work on B2C firms? So we can all we have to do is put in B2C firms in the antecedent conditions and B2C firms in the outcome condition, and we can test it on B2C firms. That's business to consumer firms. And this was what we found out in version 9, in lesson 9. This was testing the model of ROA in the year 2015 for firms. So saying that cases that or firms that did high in return on assets in 2011, right here, and actually did well on government or badly on government. The point is on this model that I use the data analysis command, so it'll model anything that works among these combinations. And this is so ROA for 11, G or governance for 11, S social for 11, and then E environmental for 11. And we found out that 3 models worked well, and low score in social was in 2 of the 3 models. And there's a negation of one of the ESG factors in all 3 models. There's at least one negation. So the first model has a negation of governance and a negation of environment, and the S is not in the model, signifying the S is not irrelevant to the performance of this model. And the consistency of the model is quite good. It's 0.86. I'm going to get out of this for a second, and I'll just underline that 0.86 here. So the consistency indicates that about typically about 5 cases, at least 4 cases out of 5 will have high scores in this model as an outcome for the cases that are high on the antecedent condition, and this represents the antecedent condition here on the left. All that taken together, remember how you compute that. You take the lowest value among these 1, 2, 3 conditions that are in the model. There's only 1, 2, and 3 conditions in the model, and everything is scored on a 0 to 1.0 operation, and then the second model, it also has a negation of G and a negation of S in the model. And then the third model actually has low ROA in 11, indicating high ROA in 15, along with these 2 conditions, which includes high governance and low social condition as a configuration. So sometimes a firm can turn itself around in terms of ROA and perform well in a couple years down the road that had low performance back in 2011, and that model works okay. It's above the benchmark in consistency. So if we go back to and low S appears in 2 of the models, which is interesting. So basically, Friedman idea that this is what firms should do, it works on an actual data set, that you don't seek out to do well on corporate social performance if you want to do well on corporate financial performance. And I'm a bit surprised how this turns out to support Friedman. I guess I shouldn't be, but there's been a lot of promotion of the idea that high ESG contributes to high financial performance. And the evidence of this sample of Swedish companies for different years does not support that proposition. And so here's the actual findings of ESG 11 and ROA 15. Okay, so if you look at the bottom on the x-axis, you got ESG 11, and this is what's been promoted, that if you do well in your overall social performance, it's going to come back to you in terms of high financial performance. But look at the consistency of this, 0.586. It's not very good. And if you look at the XY spread of cases of firms, of these 66 firms, you don't have a clear pattern supporting the idea that prior high performance, say above 0.5 or 0.7 on the X, will give you high performance on the Y. It's not there. So, and then let's turn it around and say, how about return on assets at 11 gives you high performance later on? If you do well earlier, you're going to do well in terms financially. You're going to do well later in terms of ESG. And look at the consistency, 0.326. It's not there. So again, the idea that if you do good, it'll come back to you in terms financially. The analysis does not support that proposition. So now, here's the predictive validation, where we take this one model and we look at the model that works on B2B data, and we end up with 3 models that work well in predicting ROA and 15 for just B2B firms. And we're going to take one of these models. We're going to take the first one, which is the negation of S, negation of G, and high ROA for 11, just B2B firms right here, the first model. Okay, and the consistency is 0.82. And we can actually diagram that. And so here's a diagram of it. And we get, we're above the benchmark. We still have some firms that are in the middle in terms of the antecedent configuration of not S and not G. And if we go back here, this is not S and not G, okay? And I have MG, but it should be not NG on the x-axis. And one of the reasons why this model does very well is because there are no firms that have middle or high scores on this model that have very low scores on return on assets. And so the XY plot might not look that great, but it does support the idea that if you keep your social contributions down, in other words, don't treat employees extremely well, pay them low, and give them say poor health care benefits. Of course, remembering Sweden has typically very, very good health care program and reasonably high salaries compared to the U.S. The Gini index for prices is compared to income is much lower than the Gini index in the United States. But the model works. I'd like to see the model work a bit better than this. But this model at the top here shows the model. It actually is predictive of high return on assets in 2015. Now, here's the test of the same model, only for B2C firms. And so does it work on B2C firms? And the answer is yes. The consistency index is 0.867, and the coverage is 0.332. So again, we have a big area down at the bottom that's empty. And so we don't have low performance on return on assets in 2015 for the firms that have high scores or medium scores on the antecedent condition, which is low social and low governance and high ROA back in 2011. So again, the beauty of that is that we're using the same model on two separate sets of data, and reviewers and editors and scientists in general love to see replication findings. So sometimes if the editor is not trained very well, or the reviewers haven't examined the statement, relatively new in research, they tend to say, well, you haven't done anything new. You haven't, you're just testing the same thing on different samples. But in the hard sciences, being able to replicate is considered a vital step in confirming the generalizability of the research findings. So I really urge you to do the replications research and report it in your papers that you plan to submit for publications. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example of an actual study that another study. The first one, the Swedish sample study, has it is an actual study, and a paper has been published using the data by Isaacson and Woodside, and but what I showed you today has not been published, and it's something I need to get around to writing up with my colleague Lars Isaacson, a Swedish colleague who works in Australia. But this is a different study involving Central American countries. Costa Rica is the first set up here. If you look up here at the top, here's Costa Rica right here. And then I mentioned, and this is a model for Costa Rica, and you're looking at our return on equity as an outcome. Case in the statement is cases high on return on equity. Equity can be predicted by these conditions. One condition is radical change in management direction in the company, R&D support, as a ratio to sales, and growth in the past 5 years, how many temporary workers it has, the number of workers, the number of markets served, and the ratio of new products to new processes, and then formal planning in the company. And what I want to point out to you that this study actually included a core model for Costa Rica, and then the next one is a core model for El Salvador, and the next one is a core model for Guatemala, and the next one is a core model for Nicaragua. And this table looks at the Costa Rica model, which is negative radical change and so forth, not high, not high, not high. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 conditions in combination here. And if you think of 3 levels of each of the 7, that would be 3 to the 7th in terms of combinations possible. But anyway, this is the model for Costa Rica. And the question is, does it work on the other countries for the cases of firms in the other countries? And if you look at the C1, which is consistency, C2 is coverage, you see that for the Costa Rica model, it's above the benchmark of 0.82, and it works quite well on 2 other countries, the cases in Guatemala and Nicaragua, but not in El Salvador. But if we go down to El Salvador's model and ask the same question, which is somewhat different, it's a bit different than the number of markets served is low for the El Salvador companies, and it's high for new products compared to new processes, and it's high. And it's high in formal planning, but there's a couple of the conditions that are different in the model being tested. But for El Salvador, consistency is 0.82, and that model works for Guatemala, but not for Nicaragua and not for Costa Rica. And then the third one is the model for Guatemala, and that's a bit unique, and that works well in Costa Rica, but not in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And the last one is for Nicaragua model, and that works well in Guatemala, but not in Costa Rica and El Salvador. So these, we have here 4 different models that work well in about 2 countries among the 4 countries studied. And so we have some complexity in the findings, but I don't think it's overwhelming complexity. But it shows you how to look at generality, and it looks at the question of, are your findings general for different for firms in different countries? So that's a very good step to take. And now, I want to thank you for participating and attending these lectures. I do want to mention to you that if you're not familiar with multiple regression analysis, I think this is the finest book you can get, multiple regression and behavioral research. And you can get one for less than about $10. That includes shipping. Get a used copy. This is the one I recommend. Make sure you get the first edition of this book. Multiple Regression and Behavioral Research by Kerlinger and Ted Hauser. This is really a easy to read book, and it's also a technical book. You really have to learn MRA, multiple regression analysis, even though it's actually a bad practice compared to case-based modeling. The paper I'm going to make available to you explains this in quite a bit of depth. So do keep in touch. I want to briefly introduce you to robustness testing. And this is looking at calibration by top and bottom quintiles for full membership and full non-membership such as consider the top, consider A being the top quintile, and B, C, D, E, F, if you're doing grading, where F would be the bottom quintile, and you would grade on a curve to give you an idea of what the top 20% of the cases is referring to. It would be the top quintile versus calibration. Instead of by quintiles, you would do, for example, deciles, the top 10%. So this would be a case versus thinking of taking a full membership being the 95th percentile. So you would be thinking in terms of 5% versus the 5th percentile of your distribution of cases for a condition being a full membership, being a non-member, full non-membership. And so what I typically recommend is during the first, consider your full membership being in the 80th quintile. That, in other words, the top 20% of your cases for a given condition. If you have a condition with that ranges in value, say from 1 to 50 or 1 to 20, you look at your distribution and you want to set your inflection points at 20%, 50%, and 80% for if you calibrate by quintiles. Now, Charles Reagan, in his 2008 book, talks about taking the top 5% as your cutoff for full membership. In other words, the 95th percentile. That's a very stringent cutoff point. And David McClellan, who has done modeling on a case basis, recommends and he uses quintiles for his division of for the top 20% and the bottom 20%. And so I want to ask you a question. How would you calibrate the following distribution of cases? Okay, say you had this distribution of cases here, and where 54 people say they were employees in a firm and they were being rated on the quality of communication by managers to employees in the firm. And 54 said it's excellent, 7. 32 said it was 6, very good. And 10 said it was okay. And 4 said it was so-so. And only 1 said it was below average, below what it should be. What I would suggest in calibrating something like this, the responses are highly skewed to the top end. I would set full membership equal to 6.5 and maximum ambiguity at 5 and full non-membership at 3. But what you would do for robustness testing is you could try a couple of different approaches. By the way, you might hear my cat in the background here. But whatever you do, you want to report your calibration. You want to be as informative as possible. Don't have your reader guess at what calibrations you used. And now, if you want to read more about case-based modeling, this is a paper I would recommend, and I'll be happy to send you a copy. You can get it at the journal Psychology and Marketing. It was published in 2019. Now, I've published over 500 papers, research reports, in more than, I'd say more than 50 different journals. this is my top paper that I consider in my life. This would be my opus. And the paper describes why and how to end bad science practices and shallow information from data reporting by embracing a seemingly minor but quite radical, different research paradigm, which is asymmetric configurational testing, because it matches the complexity that's inherent in your data. And if you use VDR, variable directional relationships, such as correlations and regression analysis, also use case-based modeling. And I think you should use VDR because the readers expect to see it, because most researchers, that's all the training they have in the behavioral sciences. They haven't had any training in asymmetric case modeling, and which is a pity, but it is changing. We have a rapid increase in case-based modeling, such as using fSQCA. So now, if you write, drop me a note, Arch, send me the accurate case modeling paper, and I'll send it to you right away. If you want to, I'll send you a copy of this book, an electronic copy of the book, and it has several different studies on case outcome modeling, and just send me a note requesting a copy, and I'll go back to that briefly in a second. And again, there's my email, march.woodside@bc.edu, and I'll send it to you. I'd like to thank Pedro Burnell, my colleague and producer of these 10 lessons. He looks almost, in real life, almost as good as this picture. So if you come across him, please say hello. He's a good researcher as well as a good friend. All right, so I'm going to close off. And thanks very much, Pedro, and thanks to all the participants in this program. I look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye now.